Hello and welcome to week 2 of EDU 360, teaching middle and secondary students. And our focus this week is going to be on lesson planning. Just a quick review of dispositions. In order to be a professional teacher, you need to be punctual, prepared, you need to participate and show professionalism. So you will be evaluated each session over these dispositions. Also, a review of the vocabulary for week 1. There is a post-test that you are expected to take, so make sure you get that done. And a reminder that the Teacher Toolbox portfolio is your digital portfolio that you will store all your tools for effective teaching, and this is going to become your summative assessment. And just make sure that you are adding to that as we progress through the course. Go ahead and get a portfolio started, either an e-portfolio or something in your own computer, and think about strategies that you want to add, reflections, link to online sources, and artifacts that you create. And I highly recommend that any handouts that I provide would be a good source for your portfolios. So I wanted to review your field experiences. Those are coming up pretty quick, and we are going to be going over your field observation forms, and this is the rubric that it will be used to evaluate you when you're having your field experiences, and it will be a final evaluation. This is a formative assessment, however, because you are practicing, so you'll receive this evaluation. It's just a way to provide feedback for you and show areas where you have strengths and areas where you have room to grow. Quick note, please refer to the handout in Canvas to see all the criteria that you will be evaluated over. Also, we're going to continue on with Bloom's taxonomy and our 4-part learning objectives. So the goal is to become more familiar with each of the different levels of thinking. Hopefully you're starting to learn those terms and the action words that go along with the different levels of thinking, and you're able to apply those in your lesson plannings, in your 4-part objectives and creating your lesson plans. And a review of 4-part learning objectives. Hopefully those are also becoming more familiar to you as well. Continuing to use the template that the learner will demonstrate the Bloom's level of thinking, the skill or concept that the student will be learning, and then how they'll do it and the output that will show that they are learning it. For example, the learner will demonstrate analysis of poetic elements by identifying figurative language in selected poems. And so you want to look for your Nebraska Department of Education content standards. That's what we will be using when we're creating our lesson plans, because that's what you'll be teaching. So you'll want to find your content standards for your for the content area that you'll be teaching in. And if you know what grade level you'll be teaching, that's even better. And those can be found on the link right there. So our learning objective for week 2 is the learner will demonstrate application of assessment by implementing gradual release of responsibility in a lesson plan. So basically you're responsible for, or you will be learning, you will be implementing gradual release of responsibility in your lesson planning. And we talked a little bit about gradual release of responsibility last week, but we'll go into more detail this week. Also, I wanted to go over your note guide for week 1, elements from Marzano's text, and just do a quick review of those. Hopefully you are finding those to be helpful and interesting, and it will become even more interesting as you start doing your field experiences and you start seeing these elements in action. So you were asked to read elements 1, 2, 6, 8, 9, and 15 in your text. And then you also got to choose 2 of the elements of your choice, any of the other elements, as long as they weren't highlighted. And then you're filling out columns A and B in your note guide, which hopefully you shared with me as a Google Doc. So Marzano talks about his model of effective instruction includes three things. Two of the things that we looked at with the elements for our reading this week were feedback and content. And just a refresher that feedback is that information loop occurring between the teacher and the student as the teacher is giving instruction and then assessing them, and then students also becoming aware of what they should be learning and how they're doing. So a constant loop. And content is the lesson progression. So it's the teacher presenting the material and helping them move up those higher levels of thinking. So they go from an initial understanding or comprehension of content and then moving on up, reviewing and upgrading their knowledge, hopefully getting to that highest level of thinking. So element one has to do with assessment and providing feedback. So one of the ways that we provide feedback is we have to start with clear learning objectives. So that's that four-part learning objective. We have to know what we want our students to learn, and the students have to know what they are going to be learning. We also need to know how a student has achieved the learning objective. How will they demonstrate proficiency of the standard? So Marzano talked about two ways to do this. He talked about rubrics and proficiency scales. An example of a rubric, you're probably very familiar with rubrics. You've probably been assessed with rubrics before. You may have even created rubrics before. And this is an example of a rubric that I created to assess you on your four-part learning objectives last week. So you can see there's a criteria column, and these are the things that demonstrate that you are learning the objective. And then the ratings or the indicators are the scales, right? The levels at which you're showing me that you have achieved the learning objectives. So for example, in writing a four-part learning objective, are you able to clearly articulate four-part objectives and aligning them to the Nebraska Department of Education standards? And so you might meet that standard, or that criteria, you might partially meet that criteria, or you might not meet that criteria. So feedback for me to show me where you're at in achieving the criteria of the standard or the objective, and feedback for you to see where you're at. Another way to provide feedback is to use proficiency scales. And Marzano in his text does provide an example of this type of proficiency scale. I have not actually used this type of scale before, so you're welcome to try it. Might be interesting. Personally, it's a bit confusing to me. So, this is where your teacher instincts come in, and you assess things, you evaluate, and you say, this might work for me, or I don't know if this works for me, or maybe you give it a try and you see. So I personally haven't used it. You're welcome to try it if you want. The proficiency scale that I'm more aware of or comfortable with is one that we're all used to seeing probably, is the percentage scale, and then you've got the letter grades. And then if you have a 93 to 100%, you've met the learning target, and so on and so forth. So you can use whatever means you want to provide feedback to your students. It's your choice. These are just some examples for you to use. And I also wanted to note that for me, one of my teaching philosophies is that I grade in pencil. And what that means is my goal is to have students demonstrate proficiency, right? So at least get to the 77 to 84%. You're at least approaching the learning target, and hopefully close to meeting, but it's not realistic to expect that all students will get 100%. So I'm happy with this range. This is a passing range. If you're in this area here in the redo, anything lower than a 76, you will be required to redo, and I will help you redo so that we can get you to demonstrate proficiency. I don't move students forward until they have demonstrated proficiency. So that's a personal teaching philosophy. Element 2, Marzano talked about tracking student progress. So as we're assessing students, what kinds of assessments are we going to use to to show students making progress toward achieving that learning goal and showing proficiency in it. So 2 types of assessments are formative and summative. And Marzano gave some examples of those. He talked about formative assessments being obtrusive, unobtrusive, or student-generated. And an example of an obtrusive might be like a paper and pencil test, a multiple choice test or something. Unobtrusive would be going on while students are working and they don't interrupt the flow of instruction. Students might not even know you're doing it. And then you have student-generated tasks, and I haven't done much with that, but it seems like it would be a really powerful way to get buy-in from students, and that's where students create their own tasks to demonstrate competence. Summative examples are, so these occur at the end of a unit or end of a learning, where students will demonstrate where they're at as far as the learning objective is concerned. So an example of a summative assessment might be a portfolio or a test or something of that nature. Element 6, Marzano talked about chunking content, and he believes that instruction is more effective for students if you break up that content into small chunks. And he talks about pre-assessment, and pre-assessment is a great tool for before you start your instruction on your learning objective, is seeing where students are at in that learning objective. And you might find that some students are already there and some students are not even close. And that gives you information that you can use to drive your instruction. So as you're working through your instruction, break things up into small chunks and give students plenty of processing time. I'm sure you can all think of a time when you've either experienced yourself or observed where a teacher went through things quickly, and you kind of see the look of lost, like people are totally lost on students' faces because they just aren't given enough time to process, and it's just too much information to process. So be aware of those things. Element 8, Marzano talked about how students can record and represent the content that's being presented to them. This helps them process it. And you can use linguistic or non-linguistic representations to do that. So linguistic would be words and non-linguistic would be pictures or things of that nature. So an example of this would be maybe like vocabulary. When you're doing vocabulary at the beginning of a unit, you could have students represent the vocabulary by writing out the definition with words, but you could also have them draw a picture. Element 9, Marzano talks to us about, as we're progressing through the lesson, to make sure that we provide students with structured practice. And this was a really good element. It had lots of really interesting, helpful information that an effective teacher will use. So he talks about modeling and guided practice and close monitoring students as they're practicing, and then providing frequent structured practice in a variety of ways to practice. And this is how students are going to learn the content that you've presented to them, and you're going to be formatively assessing them as they're working through this, providing feedback, and helping make sure that everybody's on track to achieve the learning objective at the end when they take their summative. So gradual release of responsibility is something that you will be incorporating into your lesson planning, and we're going to go into more detail in just a little bit about that. So gradual release of responsibility is also goes by the acronym GRR or GR, and it's a way for teachers to set up their lesson plans. So it starts off with the teacher being responsible for the modeling and sharing the instruction, right? Presenting the content. And then we then gradually pass on the responsibility for the students for them to learn the content through guided practice and independent learning. And a really easy way to remember this is the I do it, we do it, you do it together, you do it alone. So the I do it is when the teacher is starting off the lesson and they provide the learning goals, and then they demonstrate or model the instruction. And then shared instruction is we do it. So the teacher is providing content, but the students are also participating. And then it moves to guided practice where you do it together. So now the teacher has given the students time for guided practice, and they will be working in pairs or in groups, but they're working with each other. And then that moves on to independent learning where you do it alone. This is where the student is working independently on homework or some type of learning activity, and they're demonstrating their proficiency independently. And we are going to take what we've learned about 4-part learning objectives and the gradual release of responsibility and the state content, the Nebraska Department of Education content standards, and we're going to start working with our College of St. Mary lesson plan template. So we're going to be doing some practice with this, and then there will be a formative assessment where you will actually be submitting a College of St. Mary lesson plan of your own. Now this is modified. We're just going to start with just a section of it. There's more to the lesson plan, but we'll add that later. So our focus for this lesson plan is going to be on the lesson or activity information. You'll be looking at the content standards, the objectives, and the assessments that will demonstrate student learning, and the materials that you will need. And I've provided an example for you, and both of these templates and the example can be found in Canvas. And so this gives you a chance to look at a really good example of a completed lesson plan, and that will help you as you work through your own. So our vocabulary for this week, there's a pretest if you go ahead and take that in Canvas. And remember that this is a formative assessment. This is the pre-assessment, so it helps me know what you know about this information. And then there'll be a post-test at the end of week 2 that you can take over these same words. And for our note guide for week 2, I would like you to look at Marzano's elements 4, 5, 16, 19, 22, 42. Those are going to be highlighted in pink. And then you also get to choose 2 elements of your choice not highlighted at all. So continue to add to your note guide, filling in columns A and B, learning about these elements, and again, you'll be able to have a chance to watch these in action once you start your field experiences, and they'll start to really make those connections to what they are and seeing them actually happening. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you next week.